CSS Grid is one of the most powerful layout tools in CSS, but it can feel confusing at first. In this tutorial, I'll show you 5 essential grid patterns you'll actually use in real projects, from equal columns and responsive layouts to grid areas and spanning cells. By the end, you'll understand not just how to use CSS Grid, but why it works. Let's begin with the simplest CSS Grid layout. I'll create a new section with a heading and a short description so it's clear what we're building. Next, I add a container called Grid Basic, and inside it I place 3 div elements. These will become our grid items. Right now they're just ordinary HTML elements, but in the next step we'll use CSS Grid to automatically arrange them into 3 equal columns. First, I'll style the boxes so they're easier to distinguish. Then comes the important part. Setting display, Grid transforms the container into a grid layout. Next, grid template columns. 1fr 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 creates 3 equal columns by dividing the available space into 3 fractions. Finally, gap 10px adds equal spacing between every box, giving us a clean and organized layout. Our next example demonstrates how to combine fixed and flexible columns. I'll create another section with a heading and a brief description, then add a container called Grid Mixed. Inside it, I place 3 grid items. The first item represents a fixed width column, while the second and third will become flexible columns once we apply CSS Grid. First, I'll style each grid item by adding a blue background, white text, padding, rounded corners, centered text, and bold font so they're easy to identify. Next, I turn the container into a CSS grid using display, grid. Then, I define 3 columns with grid template columns. The first column has a fixed width of 120 pixels, while the second and third columns use 1 and 2 fractions of the remaining space. This means the last column will always be twice as wide as the middle column. Finally, I add a 10-pixel gap to create consistent spacing between each grid item. Now, let's build a responsive grid. I'll create another section with a heading and a short description, then add a container called Grid Responsive. Inside it, I place 5 grid items labeled A through E. At the moment, they're just regular HTML elements. In the next step, CSS Grid will automatically adjust the number of columns based on the available screen size, making the layout responsive without writing any media queries. First, I'll style each grid item with a blue background, white text, padding, rounded corners, and centered bold text to make every box easy to see. Next, I turn the container into a CSS grid using display, grid. Then comes the powerful part. Repeat, autofit, min-max, 120px, 1fr. The min-max function makes sure each column is at least 120 pixels wide, but can grow to fill the available space. Autofit automatically creates as many columns as possible and wraps the items when there's no more room. Finally, I add a 10-pixel gap to keep equal spacing between every grid item. Next, we'll look at one of the most useful CSS Grid features, named Grid Areas. I'll create another section with a heading and a short description, then add a container called Grid Areas. Inside it, I create 4 grid items, a header, sidebar, content area, and footer. Right now, they're just regular HTML elements. In the next step, we'll use grid template areas to assign each element a name and transform them into a complete page layout without changing the HTML structure. First, I'll style each grid item with a background color, white text, padding, rounded corners, and centered bold text so every section is easy to identify. Next, I turn the container into a CSS grid using display, grid. Then I create 2 columns. The first takes 1 fraction of the available space, while the second takes 3 fractions, making it much wider. I also define 3 rows for the header, main content, and footer. Now comes the best part, grid template areas. Instead of positioning items using line numbers, I simply give each section a name and describe the layout like a blueprint. Finally, I assign each element to its matching grid area using the grid area property. CSS Grid automatically places the header at the top, the sidebar on the left, the content on the right, and the footer across the bottom, creating a complete page layout with clean, readable code. Our final example shows how to make grid items span across multiple columns or rows. I'll create another section with a heading and a short description, then add a container called grid span. Inside it, I create several grid items. Some use the default size, while others are given special classes that will allow them to occupy more than one column or row. In the next step, we'll use CSS Grid to make certain items expand and create more flexible, magazine-style layouts. First, I'll style each grid item with a blue background, white text, padding, rounded corners, centered text, and a bold font to make every box stand out clearly. Next, I turn the container into a CSS grid and create 4 equal width columns using the repeat function. The grid autorows property sets each row to a height of 60 pixels, while gap adds equal spacing between every grid item. Now comes the interesting part. Using grid column, span 2, this item stretches across 2 columns instead of 1. Then, grid row, span 2 allows another item to occupy 2 rows vertically. These spanning properties make it easy to build flexible layouts where certain content can stand out without changing the HTML structure. And that's it. We've built 5 essential CSS grid layouts, from equal columns and flexible grids to responsive layouts, named grid areas and spanning rows and columns. These are patterns you'll use in real-world web projects. If you found this tutorial helpful, give it a like, subscribe for more HTML and CSS tutorials, and let me know in the comments what you'd like to learn next.